correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPG, the podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience. Hey folks, welcome back to Me and Steve Talk RPGs. I'm Steve, and I have an honorary Steve this week. Say hello.
Hello, this is the other not Steve.
Yes, Brett Bowen from Studio 404 and all sorts of other fun places is joining me this week, and we have some fun stuff to talk about, or thought-provoking stuff, and we'll argue and whatever and go on tangents and all that kind of crazy things. But before you do that, I want to take a minute to tell you about another podcast on the D20 Radio Network, which is actually hosted by one of Brett's partners in Studio 404, that being the Order 66 podcast, hosted by, of course, GM Chris and GM Phil. And, in case you never listen to the Order 66, like none of us do, it is pretty much the place to go for Star Wars RPG stuff. They are currently working on a series called Fractured Republic, I believe.
That's right.
Where they're doing basically a campaign setting set roughly 100 years after the Last Jedi trilogy mess thing.
Yep.
Which, my thoughts, good movies, in their own way, sort of, don't care. Like, I don't need them. Is how I feel. I'm not saying they're bad.
Right.
I was perfectly happy not having them.
The weird thing is that I think a lot of the gruff comes from, and this is really doubled down if you hit the Star Wars park at Disney World, is it's not for us. It's for the next generation.
Fair.
That's why they're focusing on being the New Order and Rey and all those Jedi that the First Order and the New Republic not rebellion, but yeah. And that's what they're focusing on is the story of the park there, because that's the new thing that the little kids are going to grow up with. And that's exactly what they need because, well, they can't really show young Luke anymore. we all love Mark Hamill and that he's still around, but...
Well, yeah, there is that weird thing of time.
Yes, how dare they?
But anyway, Order 66 is absolutely amazing resource for anything related to Star Wars RPG.
Yes,
great people.
Is a great way to experience building a campaign, and they're giving you just enough to build on, and there's a lot of chatter going on about it over on their Discord, focusing around it, but still not quite enough detail that you as the GM can't put your own stamp on it and make it yours. It's just enough of a sandbox that you can still play in it.
Yeah. That's always the way I like to view Star Wars anyway, is like, okay, there's this stuff that happened, or you heard that some stuff like that happened. But, well, we'll get into that as we go on too, because that ties into other things.
Okay.
But
which I came up with a possible new bit for your show here.
Oh, good. I like this.
If you're going to put me to work as an honorary Steve, I'm going to put this out there.
All right.
So you've heard of Hot Wings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where basically a star goes on, gets interviewed, and gradually eats wings that are getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Okay, but this is a gaming podcast, so we're not going to eat wings and burn our faces off. Instead, you need Me and Steve's hot takes, where you have a pre-generated chart of 100 different topics about gaming, or examples from a particular game, and each person rolls on that chart and goes, okay, what do you think about this thing that you just rolled? And you do a hot take for no more than 5 minutes, unless of course it does, in the proper Me and Steve fashion, spiral into a complete
Us do that? Come on. I don't like that idea. Just take submissions on the Discord or via email or something.
Yeah.
I really like that. And then just, replace them as more
Hmm.
come in and we use them.
As they get used. But it's entirely possible that with a different guest on, they could roll a duplicate and still have a completely different hot take.
Hey, there we go. Yeah. I like this idea. Good thing I edit these episodes and I can save that without having to write it down.
Yep.
All right. So, like I said, Order 66, check them out. They're on all your favorite podcatcher things and everywhere. And there'll be a link to the feed in the show notes, too, in case you need that. And of course, check out the D20 Network, Radio Network homepage. There's links to other podcasts and other fun stuff there. Anyway,
Mhm.
I kind of wanted to get you on to talk because you've, okay, you're a big Genesis fan. We know this.
Absolutely.
You're also a fan of several other systems that are less prevalent, shall we say, but you've worked on, that I know of, at least 3 different engines. And as a freelancer, because
Uh,
well,
Genesis.
technic
Uh,
Genesis, Earth Dawn, and the No Longer Song of Ice and Fire.
oh, right. Yes. The Sword Chronicle system.
Yes, I don't know couldn't remember what it was called now, but
Right.
I knew what it
Uh,
was.
yeah, it was for Green Ronin Games, as they made a generic version of the Song of Ice and Fire system and made the Sword Chronicles Guild. We got invited into that to, similar to how we did on the Genesis Foundry, we got invited to put something up on the bookshelf before the bookshelf went live,
Aha.
which led to me learning the system in a month and generating 3 products for it in another month. I think it was about that much time.
But what I kind of wanted to chat around tonight was kind of spinning off of the last topic we did, where we're kind of talking about simulation, emulation, minimalist, whatever, is
Mhm.
how much does the system matter when you're playing a game? Or does it, excuse me, does it, or how much does it? And I felt like you having some connection with Earth Dawn, I feel like Earth Dawn is kind of a good center point for this discussion,
Hmm.
because it's, for anyone who doesn't know Earth Dawn, and I'm actually in the process of trying to get Josh Harrison, who was the lead dev for the current edition of Earth Dawn, on the show.
Mhm.
But Earth Dawn uses a very unique system, but it's also a pretty unique world. And I got to actually play it for the first time with you at Gamer Nation Con, and I remember specifically telling you afterwards, "Boy, this system is weird, but I don't think the world would feel the same without the system."
Right. And most of the fans agree with you.
And yeah, and I have since actually joined a local Earth Dawn game. Like, I actually play Earth Dawn in person.
Yeah. Great. I'm very happy to hear that.
Um, but you also actually, and in a sort of precursor to you getting work on some actual Earth Dawn titles, you did a Genesis conversion for Earth Dawn.
Correct.
And I have thoughts, and I mentioned some of them last time, but I'll bring them back up with you when we get to that part, as to
Mhm.
why I think Genesis actually probably has a better shot at Earth Dawn than most other systems.
Right. Which, of course, I'm going to agree with you because, well,
Well, but I think there are underpinnings to the design of Genesis
mhm.
that make that so.
Yeah,
But, like,
absolutely.
I think because there are people out there who will say, "Well, you can play any game with any system, you just have to skin it."
Mm.
It
So, in regards to Earth Dawn, so we are currently on Earth Dawn's 4th edition. Versions 2 and 3 overall did not change a whole lot. There were more like updates and whatnot, and because they changed hands for the developers and publishers, they had to sort of put out a new book with most of the same stuff to get the product launched in the first place before they could start putting out expansions for something that now existed. Generally speaking, people ignore 2nd edition. 3rd edition actually added a new element to it, which allowed you to the basically to say the discipline, aka class, design was slightly different, a little bit more structured and a little bit more personal, customizable, because the core of the discipline was one talent per circle. So this was something you had to have in order to progress. But then you would have an optional talent slot to fill with a pool of talents from that particular tier of talents. So if you're a novice, you get a handful of low level talents that you can put into your optional talent slots, and that's how you get to personalize. So you don't have the exact carbon copy, exact same warrior from one player to another to another. If many people want to play the same thing, they have slightly different, and they're not just different because of their name giver race. They're also different because of their talent choices. Let me see if I can remember exactly what I was thinking when I was making Earthbound Genesis. One of the big things that was actually very easy to translate was the concept of in Earthdawn, to power a lot of talents, you have to spend some. You basically take a little bit of damage to yourself. That's called strain. It's usually in ones and twos and stuff like that, and it's just a little bit of, as they literally call it, blood magic to empower your magical talents a little bit. Well, that translates to Genesis really easy in the fact of you take a point of strain damage to power your talent, and you're fine. And the cool thing in Genesis, of course, is that strain is much easier to manage, as opposed to taking wounds to power your abilities would be a lot more drastic in Genesis.
Yes.
The big trick was translating the magic, honestly, rather I should say the spellcasting. Because the way that spellcasting works in Genesis, of course, is you have the magic skill. Your particular magic skill gives you all these different magic actions. You set up the difficulty of your particular spell at the moment, and then you roll against that difficulty, and you hopefully succeed and do the effect. And then you take 2 points of strain after you cast a spell, pass or fail. But that's not how Earthdawn works.
See, I will say I have yet to play a caster in Earthdawn.
Okay,
I am playing a thief.
that's a different challenge.
Well, I'm not going particularly the stereotypical thief route, but that's the kind of basis of it.
Okay. Well, that's another neat thing is that Earthdawn thieves are not D&D rogues. And a lot of people make that mistake because it's a very easy mistake to make. But as you progress in Thief, you find out all of a sudden that you are half a social character, whereas most D&D thieves are not. They're generally dungeon crawlers, unless they take some social skills and whatnot like that, or these days they take a particular specialty class. So the big thing about Earthdawn spellcasting is, generally speaking, because you're not insane, you put your spell into what's called a spell matrix. This holds this magical pattern in the astral plane, and you then channel astral energy through that pattern, which then manifests itself into the magical effect that you're powering. You can then do this all day long, as many times as you want. That's not a problem. But you only have so many matrices, so you only have so many spells. Like starting off, you have 2 spell matrices, so you can cast these 2 spells all day long. Oh, you want to cast a different spell? Well, that'll take you about 10 minutes to change what's in your matrix. And this is actually what really hooked me on Earthdawn back in first edition, back in college with Phil, because that element of actually needing to prepare, but not having to wait 24 hours to change my spells, because that's how D&D worked, and also a handful of knowledge skills that were actually relevant, and you could roll those and know about particular creatures' abilities, weaknesses, et cetera, or what you're about to find around the bend, that sort of thing. So you go, oh, let's pause for a couple of minutes. We'll change our spells up. Okay, now we go through the door and go into the encounter. So it really rewarded intelligent planning play, which to a certain degree is not terribly surprising, because remember, Earthdawn is a prequel that was produced after Shadowrun.
Right.
Same universe, same timeline, but 2 ages earlier. So a few millennia before Shadowrun started up. And a lot of the same characters of immortal people. And Shadowrun, for all of its various quirks, it'll be nice there. One of the big things that I was at a panel when I went to Gen Con, I ran into to Opti and the Shadowcasters Network panel. And at some point, someone mentioned something about how how Shadowrun is better than D&D because it's not a dungeon crawl. And I'm like, okay, hang on. Running into a skyscraper is much like running into a wizard's tower, okay? Or
Mhm.
if you want to call it a dungeon, it's a dungeon that goes up instead of down.
Right.
Then it's just, the decorations are different because the walls are smoother and they're not stone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's cubicles everywhere as opposed to, you know, hay mats of goblins lying
Right.
around. The big difference, though, is that starting off the gate, Shadowrunners had the ability to do research, do divinations to look around the corner, look through walls, stuff like that. Have all sorts of ability to gain knowledge and information so they don't go into a situation blind. D&D does not give you that until much higher level. So, like starting off, you don't have that option. You just kick in the door.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, but okay, case in point, right? Does the system matter?
Yep.
Illustrated there that, but I think where that comes into play, right? It's how do you want to play?
Right.
So if you just want to play kick in the door, you can do that with probably pretty much any game system out there.
Mhm.
If you don't want to play kick in the door style, you need to find a system that supports you being able to do that.
Right.
And I think in my mind, where system really comes into play, and this is also where I have really started to kind of fall in love with a lot of these rather small, independently published games because the passion and the focus on the thing they're trying to get across seems so much greater. And I
Mhm.
think some of that is a product, in a sense, of there not being as many eyes on it, or that the eyes that are on it all share this one vision. Where in a game like something produced by Wizards or Paizo, there are rooms of editors and proofreaders, and they are very consciously trying to make a mass market product. Where
Mhm.
if you get into a game like, we'll say, Toxic Lords of the Neon Wasteland or Neon Lords of the Toxic Wasteland, I bought it, I can't remember the title. This is a game that is built because Brian Shutter thought it would be fun.
Mhm.
And so it's, here's my fun, come play it with me. Very much. I don't know if you got to listen to the episode we did about Vastgrim with Brian Colin. It was actually the first authorized Morkborg hack.
Oh, yes.
He very much, that's his design philosophy. Here, I want to have fun. Will you come have my fun with me?
Mhm.
When we got to meet him at PGX, he's a great dude. Like, even as much as he came across that way in the interview, he's just as awesome in person. And we actually got to play a session with him.
Oh, nice.
Um, but I think you get that, and to me, that's in a sense too. That's not really system per se, because in that case, he's taken and not significantly, at least as of any of the stuff I've read, modified the engine yet.
Mhm.
But when you get to, we'll say, Delta Green, things like the bonds system that they wrote into that, which to me is the hidden gem of that whole game, which really
Right.
only comes into play in campaign play, but it so illustrates the psychological wear that someone doing those kind of activities would suffer in their quote unquote normal life.
Mhm.
And look, that mechanism, that mechanic is what does that. That's a function of the system.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, who cares about the core resolution mechanic? It's that nugget of design, which you could port that to whatever in some
Possibly.
form or other, but
Yep.
but now to so just before I lose them and we end up down a rabbit hole, I want to give you the
So, so actually,
points.
hang on. Give me 1 second here.
Mhm.
So to build off of that, in that regard, system matters insofar as it draws attention. Most gaming books for a very long time have had a whole bunch about stuff about how to build your character, how your character progresses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then the combat chapter, right?
Right.
Therefore, the inclination is if they're going to dedicate this much part of the book to that particular topic, that must be the focus of the game, right? But you have all these other skills, but there's no page count dedicated to how to use them in an encounter. other than just, I guess, you roll that skill and the GM makes stuff up to resolve it. And this is something that's become a bit of a pet peeve and something that I'm looking for in systems these days is like, okay, that's a cool combat chapter. I'll get back to that in a minute. Where's your social interaction encounter chapter? Oh, you don't have one. Okay. You have all these social skills, but you don't actually have a way of resolving them in any sort of mechanical way to give social characters some actual teeth,
Mm-hmm.
which admittedly is one of the things that I am actually not just me, but I've been playing in a Cyberpunk Red game for about a year now, actually. And our fixer actually fell into a bit of a trap when she built her character because she was meaning to be a social powerhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And she bought all these various social skills, but there's no real system for how to use them. And she missed the fact that the only skill that the fixer role cares about is trading. And then one time when she actually was asked to make a trading roll, she's like, "Oh wait, I suck at this."
Well, yeah.
Because I bought everything else that we haven't asked for a roll yet for.
Well, but I think some of that in that particular context, and I probably, on reflection, I think I like 2020 a little better than Red overall, but there are some elements of Red that are superior.
Okay.
One of which is I think the way they redid all the roles or classes, whatever you want to call them,
Right.
and structured their special skill is far superior.
Mhm.
But I think too, to kind of borrow a page from Genesis at some point, say what you're doing, and then we go, what skill? Because if you think about it in the context of a fixer, they're all about information and brokering trades, be it information, stuff, whatever, connections. So that skill can be very broadly, or should, in my opinion, be very broadly applied.
Yeah.
Whether the person GMing it thinks it that way is an entirely different question. And
Right.
and that's another thing, right? Like how did the designer envision it versus how do we play it?
Hmm. And the way they translate that intent is by dedicating pages to it.
Should realistically, yes.
Right.
I
Uh,
agree. But
because
then you get into
unfortunately,
the
we haven't
cost.
figured out to transmit somebody else's brain yet in order to get people's intent not through the written word.
Right. And at the same point, like, you have some background with publishing.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's say even for that, you add half a page to each role for kind of expounding on what their role skill can do and broad uses of it.
Mhm.
So off the top of my head, there's what, 9 roles in Red?
Sounds about right.
So we'll say 10 because that's 5 extra pages. What does it cost you to publish 5 extra pages versus how many people are actually gonna read it?
Right. And then, of course, you have to, with a physical book, you're dealing with total page count and the balancing and all the binding, stuff like that, which us PDF publishers laugh at.
Right, right. Like I said, so there's other elements to it.
Mm.
And you kind of sidetracked me into somewhat defending one of my favorite designs. But anyway, now
Um,
where I was going to say
Even then,
though,
I think that the roles are fairly well defined, at least mechanically speaking. My issue is more the fact of like they describe what a skill is and what it could do, and with a couple of things like if you have it at this total rank, you can do this kind of thing. So you can sort of narrate your way through it without having to roll, which is good. But there's no, like I said, social conflict mechanics of like how to roll this versus that I can recall seeing, and just having a couple of pages to that. Like I remember the social mechanics in the original Genesis core book was like maybe 3 pages, but at least
mhm,
it was something.
fair, yeah, it's weird. Although the other thing that I kind of think of a lot of times with cyber, and it's easy to forget this when you're thinking about Cyberpunk Red. Mike Pondsmith started designing games in the 80s.
Hmm.
And he still has a lot of that, for lack of a better word, OSR mentality, I think. Like,
Probably, yeah.
Red is heavily modernized, but I think at its core, it's still kind of got that kind of, yeah, decide if this works and go with it. is sort of the base premise of it. You know what I mean? It's really weird to say that in relation to that game because it's awfully easy to forget that Cyberpunk 2013 came out in what, 87?
Yes, it was very short.
2020 was 88, I think.
Okay.
So these are games that were designed, uh, when you and I were young gamers,
Yeah.
right? And compared to other designs of their time, they were quite different for the
Mhm.
most part.
Yeah, well, that was the great thing about that time was pretty much anything that wasn't D&D was breaking new ground.
Mhm. But yeah, so like I don't know, but where I was going into where I think Genesis particularly handles Earth Dawn
Mhm.
potentially from kind of um kind of almost an overview level. One, to quote Josh, Earth Dawn is a hopeful post apocalyptic fantasy.
Hopeful horror, yes.
Okay. Hopeful being the key word.
Yep.
Genesis, as we all know, is the decopyrighted version of Star Wars. Effectively, there are differences.
Mhm.
And that engine was designed to emulate the cinematic world of Star Wars, which, what was the name of the original Star Wars movie?
Oh, good point. Yep.
A New Hope.
Yeah. All those poor people waiting to see this brand new movie, and all of a sudden it's episode 4, and they're all like so super confused. I do not envy them at all.
Okay, so that's one in just the tone it's going for.
Sure. And yeah, the adepts, the heroes, are supposed to be big damn heroes. Supposed to become legends, and their legends are supposed to build up and make them more powerful in a weird feedback loop sort of way.
Like we
Um,
see with all the characters in the Star Wars saga.
right. Although some of that is like also like training, skill, exposure to the Force, learning ancient secrets, or just being General Leia Organa. Thank you very much, man. Um,
Right, but I'm talking at a very high level here.
yeah.
You know, the other thing that I think that, and for those who don't know, the dice system in Shadow or in Earth Dawn is called the step system,
Mhm.
which is this not really complicated, but initially very confusing system of upgrading and adding dice, is the simple way to say it. You go from, D4, D6, 2D, blah, blah, but bigger dice, then you add more small dice, and then they get bigger, and so on and so forth.
Right.
That's the exact same way Genesis works.
Right. Yeah.
You add and upgrade dice. So I think there's core concepts of the design that are, while vastly different, also very similar in other ways. And so, like I said, I think that's where, because I know I told you in person, I said, I don't know that I want to play Earth Dawn, and at some point I would like to play Earth Dawn Genesis just to see how it feels, but
Mhm.
Earth Dawn, the system just like reinforces the world in this weird symbiotic way that I don't know that I've seen many games ever that do it. And
Right.
so I think if I'm going to make the argument, other than some of the points we've already made, that system does or can matter, Earth Dawn is like this shining example of, see, here's why.
Which was also especially pointed out by the fact of somebody tried to port it into other systems. There's a Earth Dawn Savage Worlds version out there that was published for a while, and there was also Earth Dawn in Pathfinder, if I recall. And by most reports that I've seen of the fans, both of them were bombs. Particularly Pathfinder because it was spell slots and stuff like that. That's standard for D&D stuff, and that's exactly what Earthbound was not being.
Right.
At least Savage Worlds was like, I didn't look at it closely enough, and now that I'm understanding Savage Worlds a bit better, it's like, yes, you know this spell, you have this many power points, you can cast it all day long, stuff like that, so long as you have power points. So maybe they converted the power points somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, I wish I've only gotten to play Savage Worlds once. I
Mhm.
actually own the core book. I have a couple of splats, like setting supplements for it. It's just one that I feel like to really get my head around it, especially as a GM, I need to run games in person
Mhm.
because, as regular listeners will know, I am tech impaired when it comes to, VTTs and things like that. And so trying to conceptually learn the VTT while also getting my head around the system
Right.
is maybe a little more daunting in my mind. Whether that's just in my mind or if that's reality, who knows? But
Well, so similarly, Savage Worlds is also the quote unquote generic version of Deadlands.
mhm,
Deadlands focused heavily on using a deck of playing cards as opposed to dice like for initiative.
mhm,
Um, Someone I read at some point or another actually likened Savage Worlds to Earth Dawn because the higher you got in your skill, the higher your dice got,
mhm.
which I thought was an interesting comparison, but not. But when you stop at a D12, that's not Earth
No,
Dawn.
no,
Getting to a D12 is like starting level character.
I think though, looking at the basics of the current Savage World design, which isn't the original Deadlands was even more because you use poker chips and cards and dice and all kinds of stuff.
And you still do.
It's progress. Yeah, but not as much as originally.
Um,
Um,
the only real difference there is without a player playing a huckster, which was the Deadlands caster, they had to have their own deck of cards to cast their spells by basically dealing themselves a poker hand, making the best poker result possible to get the result of their spell. As opposed to the GM would also have their deck of cards for the initiative tracker. So what I was getting to was having played Savage Worlds now online and in person, both with Darren West,
mhm.
who is the person to go to for your Savage Worlds training, just to say.
I've talked with him.
Oh, good. In person is just better because there's so many physical doodads to play with, throw around, stuff like that. You have the poker chips for your bennies. You have the playing cards for initiative. You have other cards that are like at the beginning of the session, he'll deal out particular cards that are your special effect for the session. I
Mhm,
think it's like you get two of them each, but you only can use one of them. And these can be good or bad, but they're definitely a significant impact to the scene. It's sort of like if you had rolled a triumph or a despair, but you get to choose when.
mhm,
And then there's possibly more things that can be added into the mix depending on the game that you're playing. But like from what I've been seeing of a lot of Savage Worlds research is that pretty much every game that comes out then also comes out with their own artwork for the various cards, their own poker chips, their own this, that, and the other thing, so that they can put out even more merchandise to theme it all to that particular setting.
mhm. But Savage Worlds, bills itself I mean, the tagline for the engine is "Fast, Furious, Fun."
Hmm.
It is renowned for being great for pulpy, quick, very fun adventure. In much the same way where I would, Genesis or the narrative dice system is cinematic, which Savage Worlds has elements, but I think focuses a little more on the math and the stats, where Genesis is a little more focused on the story in a strange way. Like, I
Uh,
get that's more
yeah.
a function of the table, but in the game itself,
Hmm. Um,
because numbers aren't there.
right. Yeah. The using symbols is activating a different half of your brain.
Mhm,
Well, at the same time, you're still counting them, so it's engaging your mathematics side, your scientific side. The fact that you're looking at pieces of art and doing that symbol recognition is kind of activating the artistic side of your brain. But also, then there's the as soon as I count up how many advantages and triumphs I have, now I'm engaging the creative side of how do I narrate this into the rest of the story.
right, and I think
Um,
that's where Jay, when he designed the original system, and we even asked him about this when we interviewed him a while back, like, the whole concept of the symbols was in a way to try and divorce that, because most of us longtime gamers will start doing math in our heads going, "Well, like, look, if I wanted to sit down and figure out the percentages for the Genesis narrative dice, I could probably do it.
mhm,
I don't wanna be bothered. It's more, well, if I upgrade it, it's a little better. If I can add another one, it's a little better."
mhm,
And that was how he wanted you to think about it.
right.
Not, "It gives me this much better of a chance." It's just, "It's a little better. It's a little better."
Right. Yeah. After having played many years of Rollmaster and stuff like that, which is a D100 system, so therefore I can in fact think of it as I have this much of a percentage chance to succeed or not. And then I come to Genesis, which has, yeah, I can have, and also have found places online where they've figured out enormous charts of like every dice combination for the chances of success. But then there's two more axes to figure out
Right.
with every die roll.
Right.
And that inability to predict it actually gave me a lot more freedom to just let them fall where they're going to and play through.
Right. I think, like you said, it helps divorce the statistical analysis side of the brain,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
I know, like, that's I've said it before, when I'm playing, say, D&D or whatever, as a player, I want the GM to use a screen
Mm.
because then I don't subconsciously peek at their dice rolls and start doing math backwards in my head.
I hear you. I understand.
You know what I mean? Like, it helps me stay more in the game as opposed to math brain coming on.
Right.
But yeah, so like I said, that's I don't know. I think, like, and I know, like, too, right? You and I having this conversation, and I don't, our average listener that may, I don't know. I think we have a fairly fanatical RPG people that probably listen to us, right? So most of them are probably more versed in systems, like you and I are. But, like, I wonder, how much of, like, this type of conversation goes over the head of someone who's primarily only played, well, maybe they played a Powered by the Apocalypse, and they played a lot of D&D, and maybe they played, Blades in the Dark, or, you
Mhm.
know you know what I mean? Like, I wonder, how do you can we even kind of explain this in terms where someone who doesn't have the background and the bordering on fanatical interest in this that many of us inside the community do, like, does
I
this
feel
conversation make sense to
I
people
feel
who aren't
fingers
mega
being
nerds?
pointed at me here.
I'm sorry?
I feel as if there are fingers being pointed at me here.
Hey, look, they're pointed right back at me too, don't
Yes, for every finger that you're pointing, there are four more pointing back. Okay, so here's what I'm going to say to that. So, like, we've been talking a bit more about. I've been chatting a lot about the fact that I do buffer LARPing
Mhm.
um, lately because it's the middle of fall LARP season here, and it is the best time of the year to do LARPing. It's nice and cool. It usually doesn't get too cold, and just something about the fall being playing around in the woods is just amazing. I do not know proper words for battlefield tactics. I have, however, had about 30 years of living it. So I know a good move when I see it, and I know how to direct people to do the thing. I might not be using the best words every single time, but I know a successful move when I see it. And I think that that might be what we're getting to here is the fact of we are putting words to things that a lot of players are going to know instinctively, but not have ever like thought deeply into or put exact words to. They just have a gut feeling of this is what they are talking about. This is what I've compared to what I've experienced. So to wit, yes, system totally informs how the game plays because like I said, the page count and system determines focus. After that, it gets into personal pace and how they particularly want to run this game setting, whatever. But first and foremost, if the system doesn't have an element, then it's really hard to run that element that the system doesn't encourage or support. Then you start going into other game systems and importing stuff from there that do that thing, and then
Mhm.
you're now doing a homebrew hodgepodge, Frankenstein game, which is awesome if you can pull it off. Now, further, if you have a very complex system, like Rollmaster, like certain hacks of Savage Worlds, just they can layer on more and more and more rules that can get very bogged down and they seem like they're a lot. You can always tone it down from there and just kind of brush off the rule and just play through. On the flip side, Amber Diceless game RPG doesn't have even a dice mechanic to it. It just has you have this stat, you have this power, go. And if you have a conflict with another character, you compare, attribute ratings, and the one who has the higher number wins, unless something happens, changes, or somebody plays dirty, that sort of thing. And the only game that I played of that added the dice mechanic of a percentile roll to add a little bit of randomness and focus and a bit more chance so that people couldn't just run ramshot over other players. So you can add mechanics to that, but that's then still is homebrewing and adding things in. I think this is also why we are seeing a lot of, and something you mentioned earlier about this is my fun, come play with me.
Mm-hmm.
And also is why we're seeing a lot of games now that are coming out for particular settings, like the $1 million or more earner that was Avatar: The Last Airbender RPG. Of like, this is a very popular setting. We're gonna take this generic system and mold it into this particular setting. It added a whole lot of material to make that setting happen, which therefore reinforces the setting. When I looked at it, I remember there was a neat thing about how to actually do martial arts training, which was a big factor of the original Airbender story, and how that has a mechanic to it to reinforce that it's an important element of the game. So, yeah, that's my takeaway there, is that the system reinforces the important factor of the setting or the playstyle.
Yeah, well, and I think you're hitting there. Avatar was done with Powered by the Apocalypse, and while I haven't read Avatar at all, Powered by the Apocalypse is weird in that it's in a way a very minimalist design,
Mhm.
but because of how it works with the playbooks, it pushes very heavily into the kind of tropes and themes that they want you to use in the game.
Right.
It,
Yeah,
it it's
it has guide rails essentially in
yes.
their playbooks or character classes, even more so than a lot of other games. Because, like, yes, you're totally a fighter and you are good at fighting, but what else do you do? You know, what else is your personality? And the playbooks actually help you a little bit with that.
Yeah, yeah. But like I said, that's a thing too. Or like I would say in a lot of ways, Powered by the Apocalypse, if you can find the flavor of Powered by the Apocalypse for what you want to do as a way to branch out from D&D or whatever your game of you've been fixated on for however, I think it's a good stepping off point in that, like you said, it has those kind of guide rails and okay, this is kind of the feeling we're going for. This points you in that direction.
Mhm.
You know, it is much more narrative than your quote unquote traditional games, but you're helped along. Whereas if you get into some of the truly minimalist games, like I'll pick on Havoc Brigade for a second. I know you never got to play it with me, but I'm
Right.
sure you and Alex talked about it a little bit at some point.
Oh yeah.
It's now that points you in a different direction, partially just because of the overall thing, and then you also have some stuff and funny names for skills. But Havoc Brigade is like you basically give them skills that relate kind of almost like the playbooks, and like this is how could you do something that would be awesomely elvish, for example, which was because for Gamer Nation Con, I did Lord of the Rings themed Havoc Brigade characters, which was actually slightly more challenging than I anticipated. But
Okay.
the definitely not Legolas character had awesomely elvish as a skill because, well, let's think about it. That's kind of what Legolas does,
Oh yeah.
right? So, and part of the conceit behind Havoc Brigade is how can you construe whatever this skill is to be useful in a very entertaining way?
Hmm.
And Alex, I just remember him playing the hobbits and
The Hobbit. Yep.
well, no, he got 3 because
Oh, right.
in
You.
original Havoc Brigade, the one character is 6 goblins.
Oh, okay.
So we went with 3 hobbits.
Mhm.
And, just, but it's like, yeah, the guide rails are there that kind of point you, but Havoc Brigade is much less about is about the hijinks. It's not about the story. So maybe it's not a good example relative to Powered by the Apocalypse. But it's what I'm saying is like there's different again, the overall design will push it in a direction, but I think like Powered by the Apocalypse has nice guide rails to sit in.
Mhm.
Havoc Brigade to a certain point, could you run it as your first time you ever GM something? Absolutely. There's very few rules to actually worry about, and I will say from personal experience, about halfway through the session, you throw most of those out anyway. It just becomes okay, how many success did you get? Sure, this is how spectacular it was.
Sure.
Because it
But here's the question. Of the rules that it does have, what rules are there to reinforce the hijinks that it's obviously going for?
so the way the game is supposed to work, basically, go to do something, you get a die.
Mhm.
Any You're only supposed to add 1 skill. We kind of go away with that because it just makes the describing it more fun. A lot of times, if you add more than 1, you add a die for a skill. You can use a piece of equipment to add a die. Now that does use up a use of your whatever thing it is. And then you have things like drives, which can add more. They're also limited use. And then there's the suspicion pool, which is generated by orcs doing orky things that create suspicion. And every character has like a capstone ability where they can then roll the entire suspicion pool. Now, when they're trying to do something as the GM, I can assign a number of dice difficulty to it. This is all D6s.
Mhm.
You're looking for 4 or higher as a success.
Okay.
Um,
So 50 shot.
yeah. So I can assign, I think it's 1 to 3, but I can also reach into that suspicion pool and add as many dice as I deem appropriate to my roll to see which of us gets more success overall
As a count, as a okay,
as a
contested.
difficulty. Now, if I use those dice, they go back in the pool after the roll.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that pool continues to build unless the orcs do something kind of unorky and sneaky or whatever. It almost works. Think of it as like the stars in GTA.
Ah, okay.
Think of it as kind of that. Other than you can kind of do this big thing to spend all the stars and cause massive havoc.
Oh, okay.
But
So
I
you
would
want to build up your meta pool of suspicion in order to utilize that as a resource, but it has the risk of giving the GM a resource, which he'll put back in, so he's not spending it, which is nice. Or they're not spending it, I should say.
but if someone uses it, that uses it up.
Right. But the thing is that the whole party is encouraged to do hijinks to build up the suspicion pool so that they can all have a big, extravagant escapade.
Thing.
Or
Yes.
yeah.
At
Um,
one point, we rolled so many dice at Gamer Nation Con, we took 2 dice trays, put them on top of each other like a clamshell, and I was actually, uh, well, Steph yelled at me after the one session this year. She went, "Thanks, Steve. Now my abs hurt too from
oh.
laughing so much." Like I said, it's
So,
wonderfully fun, and but I would equate GMing it to riding an inner tube down a hill of ice.
mhm,
I ran 2 sessions of that the same day at Gamer Nation Con this year, and let me just say I'm not gonna do that again.
right. No, maybe a little palate cleanser.
It's wonderfully fun, but it's actually taxing kind of trying to keep up with that much chaos.
Hmm.
But, like, yeah, I think, some games like that Havoc Brigade is all about the journey and not at all about the MacGuffin.
Right. Yeah, and the stories you're going to tell afterwards about the journey and the hijinks that you had along the way. Uh,
Right,
which is exactly my experience with the game because I heard about it from Alex of how his 3 hobbits wrecked some poor innocent troll who was just standing there with his legs apart, and that was his mistake.
yeah. And then yeah. Oh, but yeah, like I said, but it is really a game. And then, as the game goes, right, people start building off what, you know, uh, kind of that one-upsmanship that starts happening when things go silly at a gaming table.
Yep.
But that's what it's for. Um, but I think, yeah, some of those simpler games, but I think Powered by the Apocalypse might actually be a good choice for people branching out. Not so much in that it'll help you learn other systems, but it'll help you get more comfortable not in your native system, if you want to call it that.
I would agree that it's a good stepping stone if you're far more used to a crunchier system, then Powered by the Apocalypse is a good way to get guided and break yourself into the world of more narrative games. It still has the core die mechanic that decides everything, and as I recall, most of them are like your skills are very small bonuses, and it's like a 2d6 mechanic.
Right.
So you're generally rolling a 7, and you need to get a 9 or better to get a success, if I remember
Well,
right.
there's three. So
It's fail, succeed with the consequence, and actual success.
correct.
But like actual success is 10 or better, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So it's really hard to get a clean success. It's pretty easy to get a success with a slight consequence, which really pays off with Blades in the Dark because I tried. My first experience with Powered by Apocalypse was Monster of the Week
Hmm.
because
Might as well.
we wanted to play Supernatural. Let's be honest, but we ran into a couple of problems of how many of the guardrails there were on it. Of like because at the beginning, if you do an investigation, you can only choose to ask one of these named and numbered questions, as opposed to just I roll to investigate, I succeed, what do I get? Or I'm asking this particular question of the I'm looking into this particular thing in the scene. What do I get from looking into that? No, you can only ask these 5 questions. Like that's really weird. And then if you get the advanced version of that, you can ask anything you want. Like,
Yeah, well, see, now when I've played it, I think we always kind of went in the spirit of those questions,
hmm,
which is another kind of because I think too, as you start breaking away from some of the more rigidly statistized games, I don't know if that's a word, but
uh,
it's a concept.
the regimented game,
Yeah,
sure.
there you go. The idea of in the spirit of maybe a little hard at first, but I think that's to me, that's the whole point about tabletop role playing games.
Mhm.
It's not, like if I want to play statistical stuff, I'll go fire up whatever game on the computer or the console, or I can play with stats that way. The fun of for me with tabletop is what happens when I poke that thing with a stick.
Right. Yeah.
you know,
What's Bob the GM gonna do if I do this particular thing? Yeah.
right. And that because you're not constrained by the code of the game, it's weird because in a way what I'm saying there is like the system isn't what I'm playing for, but the system also can enable more or less of that freedom, and it can also kind of, even if they're not expressly stated, give you kind of guide rails as to what that feel is supposed to be.
Right.
And I'll
Um,
even go to there's something, and you told me before we started recording that you actually bought it based on me mentioning it again last week, a game
mhm.
called Slay Industries.
Yeah.
There is one rule at Slay Industries that or not rule, but there's an in-world concept that says so much about that world, and it's the bullet tax.
Mhm.
That it it just says so much about how that world is supposed to feel if you think about it for a while.
Right.
It, and it's one little thing, but it says so much at the same time.
Yeah.
And the general concept is that basically, well, go listen to me talking about it in last week's game of the week. But
Right.
uh
And we might be talking about it again in a few minutes.
but you know what I mean? That's a game that their dice system is a little odd, but the if you read the book and look at the artwork and read some of the stuff, it's not a happy-go-lucky game
Right.
at all. But the mechanics and some of the policies, we'll call it, of the world enforce that in a way that you need them there to do it. Like if you don't have the bullet tax in that game, it becomes an entirely different game.
Right. It's a smart way to make sure that this relatively modern setting doesn't become another gun game,
Mhm.
which in generally it should be, and the meleeers should be the rare exceptions, sort of like in Cyberpunk Red or Cyberpunk in general.
Mhm.
Like by and large, people are using guns because guns.
Right.
But when a super hyper reflex katana wielder suddenly is in your face, you got problems.
Well, and I mean, it's a very simulationist aspect of it, but the one thing that I find interesting about Cyberpunk,
Hmm,
most firearms, specifically anything think above a pistol, are actually harder to use inside of a certain range than they are Like, I know this happens with plenty long guns. I'm not sure on submachine guns without looking it up, but, like, close range is actually harder with a rifle than medium or long range,
Yeah, everything has their sweet spot. Yep.
which,
It,
again,
it's not
very
their
simulation.
maximum range. Yes, absolutely. It's very simulationist. Yeah, they don't just have their maximum range, but they also have their sweet spot for a target number. If the person isn't able to dodge bullets, which I find a little funny in the fact of, yes, please dodge this because my target number is way too high.
Well, and the way I rule that as a GM, and I don't remember if this is expressly stated in the rules, but if you elect to dodge, your dodge is the new difficulty.
Yep, that's absolutely right. That's why I'm like, yes, please dodge this because I need a lower target number.
Um, because like it just makes sense to me, and I have yet to have anyone at the table go, well, no, what, no, no, no. You're electing to do something to affect it. You will affect it.
Mhm.
But yeah, so like I said, I don't know how to wrap it up with a bow other than to say that I think how much system matters probably depends more on how you play at your table.
Right, and I actually do have a bit of an example there to also kind of finish that off. So in 2020, I got locked down for 2 weeks, and I went out and went searching for because I had just gone to my first and so far only Gen Con in 2019, which is also when they released Shadowrun 6th edition.
Hmm.
So I got my copy of that. I'm going to skip over the whole part about they then put out errata immediately. Therefore, the book was actually kind of a waste of space. But then I was looking to actually get into a game for it because I was doing research for Anarchy in Dragon City. So I finally found an online game that I could play for 6th edition because at that point, everybody was hating on it because it was the new kid in town. So the people who actually wanted to play it was fairly small and far between. I got onto one game. There was really one or two GMs that were running regularly, but one of the first games I played, it was extremely smooth. The GM pretty much just ran with everything we did, reacting to it. I'm not sure how much he actually had statted out ahead of time, or if he was just completely going off the cuff. But he felt very prepared. He completely let us do what we wanted to do, and rolled our dice and reacted to it and stuff like that. But by and large, and this really comes with a lot of system mastery, especially for Shadowrun, which is so complex. Is like, okay, now that you have this much comfort with the setting and the system, you can you can damp down the importance of the system, focus more on the setting, and roll with it.
Hmm.
And therefore, you get a better feel of the game, if not necessarily, and without getting completely bogged down in all the minutia that you could possibly do in a very crunchy game like that. Which, especially for a short run online one shot, 4 or 5 hour long game, is important to get through the whole thing.
Hmm.
Um, which is why I said previously, you can always kind of have a complex system and go down, but it's harder to go from a not complex system and go up to after a certain point. You can add one thing or another thing or another thing, but then after a while, you're beginning to basically build your own system.
Hmm.
And to completely wrap a bow on it, that was the big thing that I found was the helpful bit about making Earthbound Genesis. In the fact of when you're building a setting into Genesis, you need to do it from narrative first. But yes, at the same time, because Earthbound was originally so narrative and mechanics ingrained in each other, it kind of made it extra simple because okay, I'm going to need spell matrices for casters. I'm going to need these things for the fighters, stuff like that. But then running it, it was very much okay, what's within the realm of possibility for the setting to do when lots of advantage or triumphs are rolled? What's an appropriate thing for, okay, you just did this thing and you rolled a despair right in front of the horror. Well, I guess the horror is horror marking you now, and they're going to do all sorts of horrible things to you or through you if this conflict doesn't end in the horror's death.
Yeah.
So in that regard, the system was easy to build because you build and play because of mastery of the setting.
Yeah. I think, yeah, mastery does. And I think that's a thing too. Like, right. I feel like I get a mechanical grasp of systems fairly easily.
Okay.
Um, that said, having played games, the one I would point to in my experience where the GM's mastery. I've gotten to play Mutants and Masterminds twice with Alex Thomas,
Right.
who's
Yeah.
now the sy- he's one of the lead devs for the system. He wasn't originally it long anyway, but his mastery of the system makes what is, by my understanding, without ever having really tried to read it, a fairly crunchy system
Mhm.
play extremely smooth at the table.
Right.
You know, and so that is another thing, right? Like, I think if you're just stepping into GMing a game that you've played with someone who's run it for years, or you played it at a con with someone and you had a really great time, don't expect you running it to run as smooth, and I'm saying this to be realistic, right?
Absolutely.
If you go and you listen to John Mayer or Joe Bonamassa or, Van Halen, don't go expect to go to a guitar store, buy a guitar, and sound like those guys in a couple of weeks.
Right.
You know,
So yeah, this is basically another edition of the Mercer effect.
in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Mercer effect, although Seth Skorkowski did a really neat episode about that one time, and I forget, because, the whole idea that don't expect to be Matt Mercer.
Hmm.
But he was talking about, he had an experience where he had a player that played with him that was always talking about, I'm gonna call the other GM named Bob, and the way he did this, and, "Man, Bob does this so much," like, and so he always kind of felt like he was living in the shadow of this Bob to this player. And he said then a few years later, he was at some, like, party or something, and he met Bob.
Ah.
And Bob goes, "Oh, you're that Seth that I keep hearing about that does this and that and whatever way better than me."
Wow. Well, at least it's going both ways.
And so, keep in mind too that, what you do great as a GM may not be what I do great as a GM, but that's reciprocal.
Mhm.
I can probably do some things as a GM better than you can. I don't know what they are, and, you know, I'm not trying to be that analytical about it, but, certain people do certain things better. You may run one style of game much better than you run another one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone has their sweet spot, but
Yeah.
they need to experiment with different games in order to find that. Um,
Yes.
uh, so because it's coming up soon, PAX Unplugged, we went to my friend, well, Phil, myself, Alex, and our friend Tim all went down to run stuff for Edge or FFG at the time. We were running Genesis and Legend of the Five Rings that had just come out, stuff like that. And Tim and I were running L5R, the exact same module, the Wedding at Hente Castle. And because of different encounters with the PCs and different things they were looking into and different abilities they use, et cetera, we came up with different responses for how to play through the module in order to have different focus on different aspects of the module. Because of course, the module is too long for a 4 hour session
Mhm.
to get through absolutely everything. We were sharing a room, so then later that night we compare notes and like, oh yeah, when they looked at this thing, she looked at the lion ancestor Shugenja, looked into the ancestor spirits at this person, and saw a whole army of spirits waiting behind them. I'm like, oh, that's a great visual. I'm totally stealing that if someone does that.
Mhm. Yeah.
um, and other things like that, and just various other fun stories that we shared with each other to kind of arm ourselves, share our golf bag of tricks with each other, and then the very next night we're like, "Yep, I totally used that thing you came up with."
Yeah.
So your player is doing you a favor, although it may not feel like it at the time.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like, I don't think there is a best GM, but most GMs have a strength, and I think the trick is to figure out what your strength is and lean into it and
Mhm.
find ways to mitigate the things that cause you to stumble,
Correct.
be that
Absolutely.
via system or whatever.
Yeah, depending on if you are a system GM or a narrative GM, and there, of course, that's a spectrum. But yeah,
All right. Um, Anything more you have on thoughts on this topic other than I know we could both sit here and talk all damn night?
I promised this. I promised I was not going to have another 4-hour session that we only record 1 hour of. So, so no.
All right. So, you got anything fun coming up with Studio 404? Anything else?
Yeah, we do. So we are working on going to Total Confusion Convention or TotalCon in February of 2025. That's February 20th through 23rd. It's in Marlborough, Mass, which is really easy for most of us, except for Darren. He's going to fly from Texas to come join us. So we've already set up a bunch of events on what is it again, tabletop games, the exact same website that Gamation.
Tabletop.events.
Yeah, events. Thank you. We've already set up a number of games there to run Anarchy in Dragon City, Starcana, and also what we've been working on lately is Anarchy in Dragon City in Savage Worlds. So it's going to be the debut and testing of that. So if you like Savage Worlds or you like testing new stuff, that's the place to go. So that's the next big thing. It's also entirely possible we are going to be testing out modules that we're going to then bring to Gamer Nation Con in April.
Cool.
There's likely going to be some, if you will, door prizes. We're also talking about a raffle for a prize at the end of the convention. And all things considered, this is a inexpensive convention. So like I think just a door pass is $30 a day.
Hmm.
So and the entire convention is less than $100 if I think that's right. But it's all available on totalcon.com. So I'll hit you up with that later for the list
Okay.
of URLs we're going to have.
Hmm.
And of course, all of our stuff is available on studio404.com to head over to the Foundry for our Genesis stuff or the Chronicle Systems Guild page from Green Onion.
Cool. Cool. All right. Well, I think with all that, it's game of the week time.
Yeah, game of the week.
Woohoo!
Game of the week. Game of the week.
All right. You want to go first or you want me to?
I will go first since I already started whetting your appetite with it.
All right.
So part of the reason that I splurged and bought the Slay Industries that you've been talking about so much is because a friend of mine who's been talking it up for years finally started a game of X-Crawl. This was a setting that was built up, I think, back in the 90s and has gotten a couple of reiterations, both in D&D and Pathfinder, and now they apparently just came out with an OSR game of it just a couple of days ago, as of the recording, which is X-Crawl's Classic, the role-playing game.
Mm-hmm.
So X-Crawl is pretty much modern day, except it's the North American Empire, which is still very much based on the Roman Empire. Technology has not advanced as much as it has in modern day. Instead, it was very much advanced by magic. Various magic like necromancy and divination are illegal. President Ronald has been in charge for a very long time and is totally not a lich. People are relegated to fantasy level era technology for the most part, but there are magical cars and magical planes and magical assault rifles that only the guards get to use. Totally powered by magic, I promise you.
Mm-hmm.
But the big thing is that X-Crawl is a fantasy world where the most popular sport is extreme dungeon crawling. Professional adventurers pit themselves against manufactured dungeons live streamed via spell phones throughout the North American Empire. Each dungeon is designed by a dungeon judge, or DJ, who builds arenas filled with horrific monsters, lethal traps, magical hazards, and challenging puzzles that you won't find in your normal dungeon setting. So if you ever want to just throw together a whole bunch of things like that don't have any reason, dungeon ecology does not exist in X-Crawl. There does not have to be any rhyme or reason about what the entire dungeon has, except for what makes sense to the dungeon judge character theme or story that they're trying to tell. One of the fun aspects of this that I'm looking forward to in particular is there's your X-Crawl life and persona, which can be extremely, WWE wrestling, ham it up all the way, get people roaring in their seats, do your best impersonation of The Rock, what have you, do a face turn or a heel turn, figure out your signature move, all sorts of stuff. But
Mhm.
then you get to enjoy all the fame and fortune by going out of the ring and going up to the new hot club in town and saying, "Don't you know who I am?" And then you get let in because of your fame rating, stuff like that. But at the same time, there's this, and then when you're outside of the ring, you get to deal with your coach and your agent and your fans and stuff like that. And you get to take money out of your X Crawl winnings and spend it in your real life, but you can't take your real life money and put it back into X Crawl. That's what you need sponsors for. So now all of a sudden you're not just running an X Crawl with a sword and shield, you're running around with a shield with your corporate logo on
This is delicious on so many levels.
it.
And, like, for what it is, but also think of the fun you could have with doing this as like a plug-in in a cyberpunk game.
Hmm.
You know,
Sure.
like, it just or like an isekai type thing, a hidden world in whatever else, right? Like, this is looks like it's based on Dungeon Crawl Classics too.
Yes. Yeah, put out by
So
Goodman Games. It has been the home of X Crawl for a very long time. So there's lots of different books for it. It just happens that they look like they're just due to a old school revival version that they're supporting right now.
mhm. Yeah, no, oh gosh, this looks fun. It really does. Like, yeah, you can be Arnold, and your ex-crawl persona could be Conan.
Yeah, you could potentially have that last action hero moment of seeing your persona, your ring persona self versus your outside of the ring persona.
Or you could actually too go, like, full because I'm guessing it runs on the same engine as DCC, you could very much go full, did you ever read Joel Rosenberg's Guardians of the Flame series?
Can't say that I did.
So, it's a fantasy series from, I'm gonna say, early '90s, maybe late '80s, I'm not 100% sure on a
Oh, sorry.
timeline,
No, no, no. That was all Dragonlance. Sorry.
um, but effectively, the premise of this is this gaming group that's being run by a college professor. He somehow ports all of them into the bodies of their character in the world.
Oh, okay.
And I forget how many books there are in the series, but like I said, Joel Rosenberg was the author, and Guardians of the Flame is the overarching name of the series. I don't remember the book titles,
Hmm.
but you could very much do something like that in this, where maybe your DJ somehow contrives thing where it's not your simulated dungeon. He actually ports them somewhere. Now, how do you get back? There's oh gosh, there's so many ways you could twist this. I love it.
Hmm. Um, well, I have not read that book series. I have, however, read the Spells, Swords, and Stealth series by Drew Hayes, which has a similar concept of the very first book. It shows you a number of adventurers come out of the woods and go to a tavern. They all throw back a beer, and then they all fall over dead. Then we cut to the GM explaining to the players playing these heroes that because they ate those mushrooms out in the forest within the last hour, that when they drank the beer, it interacted badly with the mushrooms, so now they're dead. We jump back into the fantasy world, and the four NPCs who are standing there in the bar look at the four dead adventurers and go, crap, if they were summoned by the king, if the king finds out that they don't show up, they're going to come here and they're going to level the entire town. So we're going to have to take over for these adventurers and go to the king. And hijinks ensues. So there you are actually following the real world setting and characters, and you're following the in fantasy world characters, and then they collide, and that's really the overarching story of the series.
That sounds cool too.
It's very good.
All right, so X Crawl Classics. Well, mine is this fun little thing. Hang on, I gotta be in the right screen when I hit return. There we go. I found this today, and it's fairly new, I believe. Yeah, added like 3 days ago. This
Wow.
is a fate setting called
Mm-hmm.
Dungeon Underlings, and basically the premise of this is it's a dungeon crawl. Well, sort of. It's not really a crawl though, because you're playing stuff that lives in the dungeon. You're the goblins. As it says, it's a role playing game where you take on the role of creatures that you don't usually see as the protagonists of a story, but rather as the enemies that fall in droves when the heroes raid a dungeon. But now the dungeon will not be a place of passage; it will be your character's home. And so, like, there's like looks like example like write ups from what the characters are. You could be a snotling, which looks like kind of a goblinish kind of thing. A mimic, some sort of rat. Like, it just feels like a fun turn the general concept on its head.
Right.
It's fate based. The supplement's like $8. You can get the fate core rules. I think they're at least pay what you want if they're not directly free.
As far as I know, they've stayed pay what you want forever because they just wanted to be the core system to get.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it says, yeah, it's the Fate Core system, a wide variety of creatures as charming as they are evil to play with, random character creation, aids for running games with minimal prep, which is always good if you're like me and forget that you have a game to prep until like 3 hours before you're getting on the plane. Um, so yeah, I mean, and also based on the listing, it may be multilingual because it looks like the bottom half of the description
Oh,
is in Spanish.
look at that. Yep. It reminds me of an old video game, Dungeon Keeper, where you were very much building a dungeon and outfitting it with various critters. And then after a while, heroes would start breaking into your dungeon, and hopefully your dungeon would be able to defeat them before they killed you all.
Yeah, I think I played something like that for a while on my phone, like some years back.
Yep.
But yeah, so yeah, mine's called Dungeon Underlings from Zephos Game Studio. This is brand new. Um, Actually almost 200 pages. So
Yep.
and Fate is very narrative heavy and also doesn't use numbers on the dice.
Uh, yep.
All right. Well, thank you
And a
very much for coming to
whole
chat with.
$8.
I'm sorry?
And a whole $8 in case I don't think you mentioned the price yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I would just like to say thank you for coming along to chat with me and fulfill your honorary Stevely duties.
Not a problem. My pleasure.
um,
So I will say, hopefully, we could get together at a slightly more reasonable time of day with the other Steve, and we can check out this Slay Industries in real time.
yeah, I've got to figure out, see if there's maybe a roll 20 or something. Because, I mean, look, I don't have a problem everyone rolling their own dice, but the initiative tracker not in person could be really confusing.
Okay, I'll see if I can figure that out.
Yeah, I'll have to look. And of course, I think they may have a module on Foundry too, but my computer doesn't like Foundry. So,
I have invested far too much training in Roll20 to go to other tables at this point.
even if it's just to handle dice rolls. But yeah, I want to get some more Slay on the table. It's really fun. It's got this kind of like it isn't a happy world, but it's got this delightful, sarcastic like overtone to it. That's
Yes.
like the security clearance level thing. If you've read that section,
No, not
is
yet.
it makes no sense whatsoever until you think, wait, a bureaucrat wrote this. If you think it that way, you're like, okay, yep, I get it.
Right. Yeah, I felt it very similar to when I was reading. Somebody created a game like Carbon 2184 or something like that.
2185. It's the
I
D20
was so
Cyberpunk.
close. Yeah, it was fifth edition Cyberpunk thing. Um, and I was building a character and looking at the equipment list, and I was like, I can't afford any of this. And then I checked it out. Apparently, the author was actually like an economy major or economy graduate degree, etc. So this is his theory about what the far-flung future dystopia looks like is everything costs way too much.
Hmm. Slay is a little bit that way too.
That explains the gun tax, the bullet tax. Yeah.
The funny part being that, of course, Slay owns everything, including the competition.
Okay, I have good news.
Aha.
Somebody's already created a module for Slay edition, Slay Industries second edition on Roll20.
Cool. We'll have to figure that out at some point.
I can create a game right now.
All right. Well, before we fall down another rabbit hole, again, thank you for taking the time to come join us. Everybody, if you like the show, want to talk about any of the stuff we've chatted about, come to our Discord. There's a link in the show notes. We don't bite. We very seldom, well, we may bark, but usually not too aggressively. Um, but we have some fun discussions about, any number of things. And if you want to argue about the Star Wars and various series, and we can do that too. But yeah, check us out there. If you feel like we're worth it, you can throw us a couple bucks on Patreon. There's links to Facebook and Twitter, which we don't really use much. Well, I guess it's X now. It still says Twitter, so that's what I call it.
Mhm.
I think that's about it. So I think with that, thanks again, Brett, and everyone else. Be kind to each other. Get out there and play some RPGs.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter and RPGs. Find us on Facebook at Me and Steve RPG Podcast. On Discord at Me and Steve RPGs. And as always, all of these links are in the show notes. Thank you, and be kind to one another.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.